"I'll be at the bar," Mick Jagger said, facing the other direction. There was a pause. "I'm in," Keith Richards said. That was on a Tuesday in March 2014. On the Saturday, Keith Richards arrived at the Corner Hotel in Richmond, Melbourne, in a plain dark shirt, reading glasses, cap pulled low, no rings, and a name on the sign-up sheet. Brian Cole, age 70, retired accountant, Sydney. That would end up on a brass plaque on the pub wall before the year was out. Mick Jagger arrived 5 minutes later and went directly to the bar and ordered a drink and positioned himself with his back to the room, which was where Mick Jagger spent a significant portion of the next 2 hours. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe if you haven't already. The judge's name was Pete Nash. Pete Nash had been running this guitar night for 10 years. Pete Nash told Brian Cole twice across 2 rounds of competition that Brian Cole had potential and should consider proper lessons and keep at it. Both times Brian Cole nodded gratefully. Both times Mick Jagger, facing the bar, made a noise that the bartender later described as somewhere between a laugh and a small personal emergency. The plan had come from Mick Jagger, which was unusual in the specific sense that most of the plans that had originated from Mick Jagger across 50 years of shared professional life had been more logistically complicated and financially significant than this one. The Stones were in Australia for 4 nights at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, a run that had sold out in 17 minutes when tickets went on sale 8 months earlier. The Saturday between the first and second shows was free. Mick had found the Corner Hotel's amateur guitar night on a Tuesday afternoon while looking for something to do in Melbourne, and had called Keith Richards and described the scheme with the mischievous pleasure of a man who understood immediately that the scheme was perfect and was trying to communicate this without laughing so hard that the words became unintelligible. "Annual guitar night," Mick had said. "Local teacher runs it. Amateur only. 3 rounds. You go as Brian Cole, retired accountant, Sydney. You play deliberately bad for 2 rounds. We see what Pete says." "What's my age?" Keith Richards had said. 70, Mick had said. Accurate, unfortunately. Keith Richards had said, "And what are you doing?" Mick had said, "I'll be at the bar," facing the other direction. Keith Richards had been quiet for 3 seconds and then said, "I'm in." The Corner Hotel had been on Swan Street in Richmond, Melbourne, since 1975 and had been the city's premier independent music venue for most of that time. The room where the city's music scene came to hear what was going to happen before it happened anywhere larger or more expensive. Richmond was the kind of Melbourne suburb that produced music venues the way other suburbs produced coffee shops, and the Corner Hotel was the best of them. A room that combined the intimacy of a pub with the acoustics and the booking policy of a place that took music seriously. The annual amateur guitar night had been running since 2004 as Pete Nash's specific contribution to the venue's programming and had become over 10 years a genuine Melbourne institution, an evening that drew serious amateur guitarists from across the inner suburbs with the promise of 3 rounds of real competition, a modest trophy, and the specific satisfaction of earning something in front of 60 people who understood the effort involved. Pete Nash ran the night with the combination of musical knowledge and pedagogical enthusiasm that characterized a person who had been teaching music seriously for 20 years and who had developed across a decade of running amateur showcases a confident and reliable ear for where a musician was in their development and what they needed to do next. Pete had never been wrong about this in any way that had been pointed out to him. He was about to encounter an exception. Keith Richards had been in Melbourne since Thursday, had played the first MCG show on the Friday, with the specific energy that Melbourne audiences produced in Keith Richards, a city that understood guitar music in its bones and that communicated this understanding across 50,000 people in a way that could be felt from the stage at the physical level, and had the Saturday free. Mick Jagger had found the Corner Hotel's event on a tourism website on Tuesday and had called Keith Richards with the details and the plan and had been very careful not to let Keith Richards hear how hard Mick was already laughing. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger arrived at the Corner Hotel separately, 5 minutes apart, wearing different versions of the same strategy: nondescript clothing, low caps, the specific anonymous presentation of people who had been recognizable for 50 years and had learned through experience exactly how to not be. Keith Richards had signed the competition sheet as Brian Cole, age 70, retired accountant, Sydney, and had taken a seat toward the back of the main room. Mick Jagger had found the bar, ordered a drink, and settled onto a stool facing the bar. The bartender, whose name was Jake and who was 24 years old, noticed that the man who had just sat down at his bar looked extremely familiar, but could not, in the specific lighting conditions of the corner hotel bar at 9:15 on a Saturday evening, resolve the familiarity into a name. Jake decided not to ask. The competition began at 9:30. 14 competitors, one song each. The corner hotel's main room held approximately 60 people on a Saturday evening. Local music lovers, the friends and families of the competitors, a handful of people who had come in for a drink and stayed out of interest. Pete Nash ran the evening from a stool at the side of the room, microphone in hand, his notepad on his knee, delivering feedback after each performance with the direct, specific quality of someone who had given this kind of feedback hundreds of times and understood that vagueness was kinder in the moment but less useful in the long run. Keith Richards was called ninth. Keith Richards walked to the stage with the slightly hesitant posture of a man who was not comfortable in this kind of competitive context, which was a performance requiring concentration given that Keith Richards had been walking onto stages of every size since 1962. Keith Richards sat on the stool, settled the borrowed acoustic guitar across his knee, and played. Keith Richards played a blues-inflected rock piece that was technically adequate, melodically predictable, and organized specifically around not doing any of the things that would indicate to a person who knew guitar that the person playing it had been doing it professionally for 52 years. It was one of the more demanding performances Keith Richards had given that week, in the specific sense that playing badly when you play very well requires a form of sustained attention that playing well does not. Pete's assessment was delivered with the patient candor of a professional educator. Solid enough, Brian. Nothing that really stood out, but the foundation's there. Scraped through, but only just. Keith Richards nodded, thanked Pete, and walked to the bar. Mick Jagger, back still to the room, made the noise that Jake the bartender would later describe to every person he knew for approximately the next 3 years. The semi-final featured 7 contestants. Keith Richards played a piece that was marginally more interesting than the first, a few melodic ideas that hinted at something beyond the obvious without fully revealing what was beneath them. Pete's semi-final assessment was more encouraging. Better, Brian. I can feel you reaching for something that isn't quite there yet technically, but the instinct is right. With proper lessons from someone who can help you develop those instincts, and with real dedication to the practice, I think there's something to work with. Keep at it, mate. Mick Jagger, at the bar, did not turn around. Mick Jagger gripped the bar with both hands, pressed his forehead very briefly against the wood of the bar surface, composed himself, sat up, and ordered a second drink. Jake the bartender, observing this from 2 feet away, decided to ask, "You right there, mate?" Mick Jagger said, "Perfectly fine, thank you. My friend is receiving some very useful professional feedback." Jake looked across the room at the back of a man in a cap who was nodding at the judge's comments. Jake wisely decided not to pursue this further. The final round. 3 contestants remained. Zoe Harrison, 21 years old, from the suburb of Preston in Melbourne's north, who had been playing guitar since she was 9 years old and who had never entered this competition before because she had previously been too frightened to enter and had finally decided this year that being frightened was not a sufficient reason not to try. Marcus Webb, 35, a local session musician who played on other people's recordings and had decided to enter his own competition for the first time, and Brian Cole, the retired accountant from Sydney who needed proper lessons. Zoe played first. Zoe played an original composition that she had written about her grandmother, a 7-minute piece that began with a quiet, precise fingerstyle opening, a single melodic line, unaccompanied I, and built across 4 verses and 2 instrumental passages into a full-bodied arrangement that demonstrated, for anyone watching with musical attention, that Zoe Harrison had been thinking about the guitar for 12 years in the specific way that produces not just technique but understanding. The piece contained several moments where 60 people in the corner hotel held their collective breath because something had arrived in the room that was too complete and too honest to receive as anything other than exactly what it was. Pete's notepad was full by the time Zoe finished. Keith Richards at the back was nodding. Marcus played second and gave a performance of professional competence and genuine feeling that made clear why people hired Marcus for their recordings. Then Pete called the final name, Brian Cole. Keith Richards walked to the front of the corner hotel for one last time that evening. Keith Richards sat on the stool. Keith Richards placed the borrowed guitar across his knee. Keith Richards looked out at 60 people in a Richmond pub on a Saturday night in Melbourne in March 2014 and then did the thing he had been waiting all evening to do. Keith Richards removed the reading glasses. Keith Richards set them on the stool. Keith Richards closed his eyes, and Keith Richards played the opening riff of Satisfaction. What happened in the corner hotel in the first 4 bars of Satisfaction was the thing that happens in a room when the ceiling it believed it had suddenly ceases to be the ceiling. The riff that Keith Richards had written in his sleep in a Clearwater, Florida hotel room in 1965 that had woken him up at 3 in the morning and that he had recorded on a cassette and gone back to sleep and found in the morning and played to Charlie Watts, and that had become one of the most recognizable pieces of music ever recorded. That riff, played now on a borrowed acoustic guitar in a 60-seat pub in Richmond at 10:30 on a Saturday night, filled the room with a quality of sound that 60 people recognized not as a song, but as a fact, the way you recognize something that has always been true. Pete Nash's pen left his notepad. Pete Nash's notepad left his knee. A woman in the second row said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear, "That's Keith Richards." At the bar, Mick Jagger turned around for the first time all evening. The 60 people who turned toward the sound of the name also turned toward the bar, where the person who had been facing the wall all evening had just become visible. The second recognition, arriving 3 seconds after the first, was quieter but not smaller. Mick Jagger, now facing the room, raised his glass. Keith Richards finished. The corner hotel produced an ovation that Jake the bartender, who had been working in Melbourne music venues for 6 years, later described as the loudest he had heard in a room that size. Keith Richards walked to the microphone. Keith Richards looked at Pete Nash. "Pete's right," Keith Richards said. "I should keep at it. Been doing this since 1962 and I'm clearly still developing. A few more years of proper lessons and I might really get somewhere." The laughter from 60 people and from Pete Nash and from Mick Jagger, who was now laughing openly, his cover irretrievably abandoned, was the laughter of a room that had been given the perfect evening and was releasing all of it at once. Keith Richards then did what Keith Richards had come to do. Keith Richards said he was not eligible, had entered under a false name, was not an amateur in any reasonable interpretation of the word. Keith Richards said he wanted to talk about someone who was eligible. Keith Richards pointed at Zoe Harrison. That young woman played one of the finest guitar performances I have heard from any musician at any point in their career. She played it with complete truth. She is the winner tonight. Zoe Harrison, at the side of the stage, was crying. "And if she will allow me," Keith Richards said, "I would like to play one more song with her." They played for 30 minutes while 60 people in the corner hotel stood and remained standing, and Mick Jagger watched from the bar with the expression of a man who has arranged something and is watching it be exactly as good as he knew it would be. Keith Richards shook Pete Nash's hand before leaving. "No hard feelings, Pete. You were right about one thing. I was holding back, and you said there was potential in there. You were absolutely right. I just have a slightly longer head start on it than you knew." Pete Nash said, "I told Keith Richards to keep at it." Mick Jagger was at the bar the whole time. Keith Richards said, "Put it on a plaque." Pete Nash put it on a plaque. On the wall of the corner hotel in Richmond, Melbourne, in a frame, hangs the March 2014 sign-up sheet. Entry 9. Brian Cole, age 70, retired accountant, Sydney. Beside it, in Pete Nash's handwriting, "Scraped through, nothing stood out. Potential but needs proper lessons. Keep at it, mate." The brass plate beneath reads, "The night Keith Richards entered our guitar night as a retired accountant, Mick Jagger was at the bar. We told Keith Richards to keep at it. He kept at it. March 2014. Zoe Harrison won the trophy that evening, used the story of the duet to help secure a music residency the following year. Mick Jagger attempted to enter the following year's guitar night under the name Michael Smith, retired librarian from Geelong. Pete Nash recognized him at the door. Pete Nash let him in anyway. Mick Jagger made it through round 1 entirely on his own merits, without any assistance from Keith Richards. If this story gave you something, the reminder that the two most interesting people in the room are occasionally the one on stage playing badly on purpose and the one at the bar facing the wrong direction, share it today with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from right now. Every week, another story from a life that always knew the best joke only works if you play the setup all the way through.